The way light is measured is in units called stops, and this is really important to understand when trying to set exposure for your image. As I'm sure you can tell, this is very bright and the image is overexposed. So what the heck are we gonna do about this? Well, I can come over here where the light is hopefully a little better. Let's see here. Yeah, not so bright, but still kind of bright. We're still about, let's see here, a stop overexposed. But what does that mean in practical terms when it comes to the technical settings on the camera? There are 4 settings that I call the exposure square that I think you need to be aware of when it comes to shooting video. Now let's start with ISO. ISO is how sensitive your camera's sensor is to light. Now, my camera, the FX3, has a base ISO of 800. That's kind of its starting point where it's best at. Now, if I want to go down 1 stop of light, I would cut that 800 in half to get 400. And if I wanted to gain a stop of light, I would double it to 1600 ISO to help get an additional stop of light. So with ISO, you either cut it in half to lose a stop of light, or you double it to gain a stop of light. Aperture is a little trickier than ISO. Now, the most common aperture notations are 1, 1.4, 2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, and 22. Now, each one of those is a stop of light. So when you go from 1 to 1.4, you lose a stop of light. If you go from 1.4 to 1, you gain a stop of light. As long as you remember 1 and 1.4, you can easily memorize the entire sequence of f-stops. Now, shutter speed, thankfully, is also rather straightforward. If you're shooting video, the most common setting is 1/48. And if you double that to 1/96, you lose a stop of light. So every time you double that, you lose a stop. Every time you divide it by 2, you gain a stop. Now, shutter angle is a little trickier. If we're starting with 180 degrees to go down 1 stop of light, we would cut that in half to get 90 degrees. And if we want to decrease it by another stop, we would cut that in half to 45 degrees. However, increasing exposure using shutter angle is kind of tricky, because if you double 180 degrees, you get 360, which is a fully exposed disc. So it's not very practical in terms of using it to increase exposure using shutter angle. Finally, we have ND filters, which everyone and their dog loves to say is like sunglasses for your camera, which isn't wrong, but it's definitely overused at this point. Now, the way ND works is 1 stop of ND is ND2. And so every time you double it, that's another stop of light that is not coming into the camera. So you have 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, and so on. That's the exposure square. I hope this was helpful in helping you better understand how these different variables work in exposing your image.